Hi again. Dwight Wilson, Armageddon, now page 180 of the chapter The Certainty of Survival, discussing here the threat of Russia in evangelical eyes and what to do about it. Russia's allies in the impending invasion were also the topic of some discussion. It was a foregone conclusion to most writers that the Soviet bloc was the great Northern Confederacy of Ezekiel. In 1950, Douglas Ober, in The Great World Crisis, drew attention to the fact that 5 or 10 years earlier no one would have dreamed that parts of Austria and Germany would be under Soviet control. He found it particularly significant that the sections that Russia controlled were areas that had not been in the ancient Roman Empire. Evangelist Merv Rosell identified the other allies of the Soviet bloc as Persia, portions of Iran and Iraq, Libya, Ethiopia, Germany, at least a portion of it, and Turkey, together with the Arab nations. There continued to be confusion, however, as to whether this invasion by the Russians and their satellites was or was not the Battle of Armageddon. Biola's president, Louis T. Talbot, had apparently made up his mind that Russia would fight at Armageddon, for the book he had written in the 1930s with the title Russia, Her Invasion of Palestine in the Last Days was rewritten with the more timely title Russia Mobilizes for Armageddon. Moody's President Culbertson believed that present tensions in the Holy Land might erupt any moment into Armageddon now. Radio evangelist C.M. Ward of the Revival Time broadcast expressed it dramatically, quote, "The eyes of the whole world are upon the East. Will we or will we not make a do-or-die stand against the communists? When and where will this matter be resolved between East and West? God marks the spot and gives the name, Armageddon. God's hour is upon us, neighbor. Mankind is marching inexorably toward Armageddon." End of quote. Our Hope magazine apparently shifted its position under its new editor, E. Schuyler English, commenting on an article in the December 2nd, 1955 issue of U.S. News and World Report, which discussed communist expansion. English stated, quote, "Armageddon is still on the horizon, perhaps not as far off as some would have us believe." End of quote. Evangelist Merv Rosell explained in detail that right now NATO was a possible nucleus for a Mediterranean bloc of nations, which would move east through the Mediterranean, land at Haifa harbor, and meet the Russians on the plain of Megiddo for the Battle of Armageddon. Other premillenarians, though all believed the end was near, and most believed that a Russian invasion of Palestine was upon them, did not identify the immediate battle as Armageddon. The last article that Louis S. Bauman wrote before he died was "The Nations Marshalling for Armageddon." But in it he listed the present signs of the battle. One sign was the armament race. He said, "A whole world is in a very frenzy of preparation for the greatest of all wars, such as the divine revelation of the days immediately preceding the Armageddon. No human being need to be told that exactly that describes our day." End of quote. Another sign was the formation of the League of Nations, or now the United Nations. On the basis of these signs, Bauman believed that the overthrow of Russia would soon be brought about by a great military alliance of non-communist nations, which would in turn be the power that would invade Palestine and be defeated at the true Armageddon by God himself. So he believed that Armageddon was coming soon, but that the Russians were coming even sooner. In The Great World Crisis, Douglas Ober explained that there would be two invasions by God, neither of which was called Armageddon. The point he was making was that a quick and peaceful settlement of the Palestinian issue should not be expected. Any apparent peace settlements should be considered mere forebodings of the more intense struggle to come with the invasions from the north. Shadow of Armageddon was the title of a presentation made at the 1955 International Congress on Prophecy at New York City. The message was that the attempted communist takeover of the United States was making the situation ripe for the appearance of the Antichrist, who would defeat the Russians and then, in turn, be defeated himself at the Battle of Armageddon. Invasion of Palestine by Russia was then only the prelude to Armageddon, not Armageddon now, but prelude now. A similar scenario was given to readers of the Evangel magazine by Frank M. Boyd. Somewhat different was the sequence of events described in the Sunday School Times by Edgar Ainsley. In his scenario, Russia would not invade Palestine until after the Battle of Armageddon, her purpose being to grab the immense spoil that had been brought there by the nations defeated by the Messiah at Armageddon. This system rounded out the kaleidoscope of confusing interpretations of end-time events, demonstrating the great difficulty of attempting literal interpretation of biblical prophecy. Various motives for Russia's invading Palestine were offered. It was claimed that reforestation and irrigation projects were making the land attractive in addition to the amazing increase in rainfall during the past generation. The oil beneath the desert and the chemicals in the Dead Sea were depicted as necessities for the resource-hungry industrial giant out of the north. The strategic position of Israel made its invasion a necessity for any world conqueror. Moreover, Palestine was the cradle of three great religions, Christian, Jewish, and Mohammedan, all opposed to communism. Russia desired to destroy their very roots. The means of that invasion evoked a curious discussion due to the literalist bent of the premillenarian interpreters. Ezekiel 38, verse 15, described the invasion as follows: "And thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts, thou and many people with thee, all of them riding upon horses." The problem was to somehow fit cavalry into an era when war was characterized by atomic bombs and blitzkrieg. It was claimed that the Russians were still dependent upon cavalry, and a stamp of the 1930s commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Red Cavalry was offered as supporting evidence. In the King's Business magazine, Louis S. Bauman claimed in 1950 that the Russians owned half of the world's horses. Quote, "Other nations may put their trust in gasoline for mobile purposes if they wish to do so, but the wily old northern bear sensed the possibility of bombs breaking up the oil fields of the earth to such an extent that the great gas-propelled war machines will be stalled in their tracks, out of gas." End of quote. In the same magazine in 1958, Merv Rosell was claiming that the Russians now had 70% of the world's horseflesh. The Evangel carried a report of an officer from World War II recounting in the London Times that almost all the Russian divisions depended upon horse transport. Evangelist Bill Lewis in the Evangel placed the reference to horses alongside Ezekiel 38:9. "Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm," and concluded the invasion was to be by horses and airplanes. It was all too much, however, for William L. Hull, who arrived at a compromise solution. Hull said, "We have read descriptions of how Russia is buying up horses all over the world, and that this is in preparation for the fulfillment of this prophecy. However, the prophet was merely indicating that this great force would be carried. It would not walk on its own feet. Horses were the chief means in Ezekiel's day of transport, so he used that picture. But the emphasis was on riding and not on what they rode. It is very doubtful whether there will be a single horse used by the Russian army in the attack." Here, obviously, is a battle of hermeneutical procedure, and literalists do have problems, but non-literalists, I would venture, have a lot more. We'll put in a link to our discussion of Ezekiel 36, not 38, 39, the Gog attack, but rather the restoration of Israel, which is the focus of those chapters 36 through, 48. And this was a chapter that meant a lot to us in our breaking away from our Watchtower prejudices. I would even go further and say it's a chapter that led us out of the Watchtower. So I'll put that link on your screen. It's part of a playlist called Paradise Lost for Jehovah's Witnesses, 19 videos. So I'll put a link to that playlist because it covers all of the texts that witnesses tend to use to establish their paradise earth scenario. And what the context of those texts will reveal to you about the misuse of Scripture. So the Paradise Lost playlist is on your screen, as well as Ezekiel 36 discussion.